Maintenant, si vous voulez bien, Jeff Frieden, vous êtes professeur à Harvard, je le rappelle, et vous êtes grand expert de l'économie et des crises dans l'histoire du XXe siècle.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. The question we ask, the question of the hour really is the future of capitalism. I want to ask within that a question that many of us have been wondering about since the crisis first began a year and a half ago, which is, can global capitalism survive a global crisis? And if so, what kind of global capitalism will it be? To shed some light on potential answers to these questions, I want to draw two lessons from the past, two lessons from the current crisis, and to formulate one set of expectations about the future. I'm an academic, we think in lists. First, lessons from the past, and there are important lessons to draw because we have a past which is relevant to the current circumstance. We have been here before. For many decades, before 1914 and some afterwards, the world economy was tightly integrated. We lived in an era of globalization, as we might call it today, in which goods, capital, people, technology, ideas, institutions traveled across borders more or less as freely as they do today. And that first era of globalization was, on many dimensions, a success. It also survived many crises, periodic panics, as they were called at the time. However, it did not withstand one great crisis. It succumbed in the 1930s to what turned out to be the final crisis of the first era of globalization. From that experience, both the positive experience of the period before 1914 and the negative experience of the interwar period, I draw two lessons. The first is that an open international economic order requires systematic, purposive, concerted cooperation among national governments. At the time, in the 19th and early 20th century, there was a widespread view that the international economic order was self-regulating or self-reinforcing. And international markets may have been self-regulating and self-correcting, but the international economic order, that is the system itself, relied upon cooperation among governments, especially upon cooperation in times of crisis, to provide the kinds of public goods that Professor Padoa-Schioppa has just referred to. So an open international economy requires cooperation among governments. But the second lesson is closely related, and that is that governments can only work together and will work together only if they have the domestic political support necessary to undertake the policies associated with international cooperation. National governments, after all, are responsible to their constituents. And if their constituents are hostile to the international economy or indifferent to the international economy, their constituents will not stand by idly while the government enforces them to take sacrifices in the interest of something they don't care about or are even hostile to. So, if domestic constituents are hostile or indifferent to the world economy, governments have little incentive to undertake the activities necessary to sustain an open international economic order. Without that cooperation, an open international economic order cannot survive. Those are the lessons from the past. At least those are the two lessons that I would draw for this purpose. Lessons from the crisis. First lesson is that governments remain central to the international economy. In the early days of this era of globalization, there was a great deal of sentiment, in some cases hope, in some cases fear, that the globalization of markets would make national government policies either impossible or obsolete. That is, that markets would make it very difficult and perhaps even impossible for national governments to undertake independent policy. Right. As I say, some people looked upon this possibility with fear, others with longing. But what has turned out to be the case, especially in the current crisis, is that if anything, what governments do is even more relevant today than it has been in the past. After all, in many ways, the crisis cannot be understood except as a more or less direct result of national government policies. Depending on your analysis of the crisis, and I tend to be similar to that which was evinced in the last panel this morning, if the crisis is in many ways a result of American fiscal and monetary policy on the one hand, of Chinese currency and reserve policy of financial regulatory policy on the part of dozens of countries. If anything, today, markets are exquisitely sensitive to what national government policies are and what they do. So national governments remain a central component part of the contemporary international economy. Capital flows in the past period have been driven largely not by underlying differences in factor endowments, but by national government policies.